Careful, Amy, don't scratch our big bird. Leave the boom booms to the fly boys, a voice echoed. She ignored them, her focus absolute. Then a pilot saw the secret insignia on her sleeve, and the entire hangar fell silent. The cavernous hangar hummed with a low, mechanical pulse, a symphony of whirring fans, and the distant hiss of pneumatic tools. The air, thick with the sharp tang of jet fuel and the warm, metallic scent of hot oil, hung heavy under the sterile glare of long fluorescent tubes that bleached the color from everything, leaving the rows of helicopters gleaming like dormant metal beasts. At the far end of the bay, away from the casual chatter of the ground crew, Amelia Amy Carter knelt beside the formidable nose of an H-64 Apache. Her brown hair was pulled back in a simple, functional bun, a few stray strands escaping to frame a face set in deep concentration. She wore a standard gray work jumpsuit, the fabric softened with wear and stained with the faint, ghostly outlines of old grease marks. Her movements were a study in quiet precision, each gesture economical and deliberate. A small cluster of younger mechanics loitered near a row of bright red tool carts, their conversation a low murmur punctuated by occasional bursts of laughter. They were ostensibly sorting wrenches and checking inventory, but their attention kept drifting toward the lone woman working on the Apache's M230 chain gun. One of them, a fresh-faced recruit named Jake whose uniform still looked stiff and new, cupped his hand around his mouth. "Hey, Amy, make sure you don't scratch our big bird," he called out, his voice laced with the easy confidence of someone who had never been truly tested. "Leave the boom booms to the flyboys." A few of the others snickered, the sound bouncing off the high, corrugated steel walls. Another mechanic, emboldened by Jake's jest, added, "Yeah, she's probably never even seen one fire outside of simulator." The laughter that followed was louder this time, a sharp, brittle sound that grated against the hangar's steady hum. Amy didn't react. She didn't even seem to hear them. Her gaze remained locked on the intricate mechanism before her. Her fingers, nimble and sure, slid a specialized micrometer into the cannon's housing, the polished steel of the tool a stark contrast to her grease-stained fingertips. She wasn't just inspecting the weapon. She was communing with it, feeling for the infinitesimal imperfections that could mean the difference between a clean shot and a catastrophic failure. She used a fine-bristled brush to meticulously clear away microscopic particles of dust and grime from the articulating joints. Her breath held steady. She then used a custom-made caliper to measure the gap in the barrel assembly. Her eyes narrowed in focus, checking it not once, but 3 times to ensure it was within the impossibly tight tolerance specifications. A soft, satisfying click rewarded her efforts as a component settled perfectly into place. It was a sound so subtle that only someone who had spent countless hours inside the guts of these complex machines would recognize it as a small, hard-won victory. The group of mechanics, their moment of amusement over, slowly drifted back to their respective tasks, their muttering fading into the general noise of the hangar. But the echo of their casual mockery still lingered in the air, a dissonant note in the otherwise orderly environment. It was into this charged quiet that a new set of footsteps entered, their cadence firm and measured on the stained concrete floor. The man who strode into the bay was not part of the ground crew. Captain Richard "Rick" Davis was a seasoned pilot, his tall frame clad in a flight suit that had seen its share of action. The fabric was faded at the seams, and a faint layer of dust clung to the shoulders, evidence of a recent flight. His nameplate, pinned above the left breast pocket, was scuffed and worn, a testament to years of service. His eyes, the color of a stormy sea, were sharp and constantly scanning, taking in every detail of the hangar with a practiced, assessing gaze. They moved past the rows of parked Black Hawks and Chinooks, finally settling on the lone figure of Amy, still kneeling by the Apache. He slowed his pace, a faint, almost imperceptible smirk touching the corners of his mouth, as if he'd just identified the source of the earlier commotion. Captain Davis approached Amy with the unhurried gait of a man who was comfortable in his authority. He took in the scene. The focused woman, the partially disassembled chain gun, the array of specialized tools laid out on a clean rag with surgical precision. His initial amusement was that of a senior officer observing a diligent, but ultimately unremarkable mechanic. He saw the intensity in her posture, the way her forearm muscles tensed as she applied precise torque to a bolt, and he prepared to offer a word of patronizing encouragement, something to break the silence. He took another step closer, opening his mouth to speak, but the words died on his lips. As Amy shifted her weight to get better leverage, the sleeve of her gray jumpsuit pulled taut, catching the harsh overhead light at just the right angle. There, sewn onto the fabric of her left arm, just below the shoulder, was a patch. It wasn't a standard-issue unit crest or a brightly colored squadron emblem. This was something else entirely. It was a simple, black circular patch, its edges slightly frayed from time and wear. Embroidered on the dark background with faded red thread was an abstract, almost stark design. The silhouette of a bald eagle, its wings broken and clipped, clutching a single, shattered arrow in its talons. The thread, once a vibrant crimson, had dulled to the color of dried blood. The sight of it stopped Captain Davis cold. The smirk vanished from his face, instantly replaced by a look of profound shock, his eyes widening almost imperceptibly. The air around him seemed to grow still, the ambient noise of the hangar fading into a distant hum. That insignia, it was a ghost, a whisper from a past that wasn't supposed to exist in official records. It belonged to a unit spoken of only in hushed tones in dimly lit bars near classified airfields. A unit that operated in the deepest shadows, its missions and its members erased from the official narrative. His demeanor changed in a heartbeat. The casual superiority was gone, replaced by an intense, laser-like focus that felt heavier and more oppressive than the humid hangar air. He closed the remaining distance between them in 3 long, deliberate strides, his flight boots striking the concrete with a muted finality. The few mechanics who were still watching noticed the sudden shift in his posture and fell silent. Their curiosity piqued. He came to a stop just behind her, his shadow falling over her work. "Where did you get that?" His voice was low, but it cut through the low-frequency thrum of the hangar with the sharpness of a razor. It wasn't a casual question. It was a demand, each word carved from ice. Amy finished tightening the bolt, her movements still unhurried. She carefully placed the torque wrench back on the rag, its position perfectly aligned with the other tools. Only then did she slowly straighten up, turning to face him. Her eyes, a calm, steady gray, met his without a flicker of surprise or fear. They were the eyes of someone who had seen far more than the inside of a hangar. She held his gaze for a long moment before her eyes drifted back to the cannon, her silence a more potent answer than any words could have been. "I asked you a question," he pressed, his voice hardening, the timbre dropping to a near growl. The sound of a ratchet wrench being used nearby abruptly ceased. Heads turned. 2 ground crew members, carrying a heavy hydraulic line between them, slowed to a stop, their faces etched with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. The space between the captain and the quiet mechanic had become a fault line, an invisible but palpable rift in the hangar's daily routine. The air crackled with unspoken tension. From the corner of the hangar, a figure in a crisp, dark uniform began to approach, his brisk walk and stony expression signaling his authority. It was Major Paul Jenkins, the base's operations commander. Major Jenkins moved with the brisk, no-nonsense purpose of a man accustomed to command. His salt and pepper hair was cut short, and the gold oak leaf insignia on his shoulders glinted under the fluorescent lights. His eyes, sharp and analytical, flicked between Captain Davis's rigid posture and Amy's unnerving calm. "Something wrong here, Captain?" he asked, his voice a low baritone that commanded attention. Davis didn't take his eyes off Amy. "That insignia, sir," he said, his voice tight. "Raven Squadron." The name hung in the air for a moment, and a subtle ripple of recognition and disbelief passed through the onlookers. For most of the younger crew, the name meant nothing. But for the handful of older, more seasoned veterans in the hangar, it was a name pulled from the realm of myth and legend. Raven Squadron wasn't just a unit. It was a ghost story, a phantom outfit whispered about in connection with missions that officially never happened, in places that didn't appear on any map. They were the military's deniable assets, the ones who were sent in when all other options had failed, and whose existence was a closely guarded secret. Major Jenkins's gaze dropped to Amy's left arm, his eyes narrowing as he took in the faded red threads of the broken eagle. He said nothing for a long moment, but his attention sharpened, his expression shifting from mild annoyance to a look of intense scrutiny. He was measuring her, evaluating her in a way that had nothing to do with her skills as a mechanic. Ignoring the escalating tension, Amy tightened the last bolt on the cannon's access panel and rose smoothly to her feet. Standing, she was taller than she had appeared while kneeling, as she carried herself with an economy of motion, a subtle grace that hinted at a level of physical training far beyond what was required for workshop duty. "You don't wear that unless you earned it," Davis said, his words directed as much to the room as to her. If he had intended to provoke her into an explanation, he failed. She simply picked up a clean rag from her cart, wiped her hands with deliberate care, folded the rag neatly, and placed it on the edge of the workbench. Throughout it all, her breathing remained even and controlled, her composure absolute. Major Jenkins stepped forward, his voice quieter now, but edged with an undeniable authority. "Name? Carter, Amelia," she replied, her tone clipped and devoid of any emotion, offering nothing more than the required syllables. "Run it." The major commanded a nearby crew chief. The man hurried over to a computer terminal in the corner of the hangar, his fingers flying across the keyboard. The rapid tapping of the keys seemed unnaturally loud in the ensuing silence. The entire hangar seemed to be holding its collective breath, waiting for the screen to reveal the truth behind the woman with the Ghost Squadron's patch. After a moment, the crew chief hesitated, his brow furrowed in confusion. "Sir," he began, his voice uncertain, "I've got her current assignment and maintenance log for the past 2 years. Standard stuff. But there's nothing before that. No training records, no enlistment data, no previous postings. It's like," he stopped, glancing nervously toward Amy, as if afraid to say the words. "It's like the rest of it was scrubbed," Davis finished for him, his gaze never leaving Amy's face. For the first time, Amy's calm expression shifted slightly. Her eyes lifted to meet his again, as placid as the surface of a still lake. But this time, there was a flicker of something in their depths. Not fear, but something akin to weary resignation. If the tightening circle of attention around her was having any effect, she buried it deep. Major Jenkins studied her for a long, silent beat, his mind racing to process the implications. "You've been holding out on us, Carter," he said finally, his voice a low murmur. Amy didn't answer. Instead, she reached for the cannon's heavy safety cover, latching it shut with a decisive, metallic click. The sound was crisp and final, and for some reason, it sent a shiver down the back of Captain Davis's neck. Around them, the hangar seemed to inhale, the usual background noise of air compressors and distant shouts from the flight line fading into an expectant hush. The joke the young mechanics had made earlier now seemed foolish and naive. They had stumbled into something far bigger and more complex than they could possibly understand. Major Jenkins's voice cut through the thick tension, sharp and decisive. "Captain with me." "You," he said, nodding curtly at Amy. "Stay put. We're not done here." It was a direct order, delivered with the full weight of his rank. But Amy didn't stay put. In a move that was both subtle and breathtakingly defiant, she moved past both men. She didn't march or storm off. Her movement was fluid and silent, her boots making no more than a whisper on the oil-stained concrete. It wasn't an act of open rebellion, but rather the action of someone who has finished being scrutinized like a museum artifact. Her posture, her gait, the very air around her seemed to convey a single, unspoken message. If you want answers, you're going to have to do more than just ask. Every eye in the hangar followed her as she crossed the wide expanse of the floor. She stopped at the workbench where her tools were laid out in neat, orderly rows, each wrench and screwdriver in its designated place, a testament to her meticulous nature. Without a word, she slid her hands into a pair of clean, black mechanic's gloves, the supple leather stretching taut over her knuckles. She began to sort through her tools, not with any sense of urgency or delay, but at the same deliberate, methodical pace she had maintained from the start. She was in her own world, a world of polished steel and precise measurements, and the two officers behind her might as well have been on another planet. Major Jenkins and Captain Davis exchanged a look, a silent communication passing between them. The Major's jaw was tight with frustration, but there was also a flicker of something else in his eyes, a grudging respect, perhaps, or at least a recognition that this was no ordinary situation. He turned on his heel and strode toward the administrative offices at the far end of the hangar, his long shadow stretching out behind him under the harsh overhead lights. He needed to make some calls, to pull on threads that he hadn't had to touch in years. Captain Davis, however, remained where he was. He stood rooted to the spot, his arms crossed over his chest, watching her. He was a man who had seen combat, who had faced down enemy fire and brought his crew home safely time and time again. He was not easily rattled, but this woman, this quiet, unassuming mechanic with the Ghost Squadron's patch and the unnerving calm, had managed to do just that. He felt like a man who had been reading a simple, straightforward manual his entire life, only to suddenly discover a hidden chapter written in a language he couldn't understand. Somewhere in the distance, a forklift beeped its monotonous warning in reverse. The moment felt suspended, the world outside the hangar walls shrinking to the charged space between the pilot and the mechanic. He took a breath, about to speak again, to demand, to plead for some kind of explanation. And that's when the first sharp, frantic crackle of the radio shattered the air, and the world tilted on its axis. The crackle over the comms system was jagged and loud, like a bolt of lightning splitting the air inside the cavernous hangar. It wasn't the casual, routine chatter of a training flight or a logistics check-in. This was the sound of a crisis, a voice stretched thin with urgency and fear. Mayday, mayday, mayday. Tower, this is Gunship 2-1, declaring an in-flight emergency. Repeat, Gunship 2-1 is declaring an in-flight emergency. Every head in the hangar snapped toward the speakers. Every mechanic, every crew chief, every person within earshot froze, their tools held forgotten in their hands. The forklift in the corner stopped mid-beep, its driver staring wide-eyed at the radio console. The low hum of the hangar was instantly replaced by a tense, electric silence. Before anyone could move or speak, a follow-up transmission cut through the static, the pilot's voice strained and breathless. Main weapons system failure. We've got a complete hydraulic fluid dump in the secondary system. I'm fighting for control. She's trying to tear herself apart. Estimated 2 minutes to critical descent and catastrophic failure. Major Jenkins, who had been halfway to his office, spun around and sprinted toward the main radio set on the far wall. Patch me through to the cockpit now, he barked at a nearby technician. The young tech scrambled to comply, his hands flying across the console, flipping switches and turning dials with practiced speed. A moment later, the channel was open. Gunship 2-1, this is Major Jenkins. Do you copy? A thin veil of static hissed for a second before the strained voice of the pilot replied. Copy, Major. I'm fighting the cyclic. She's wanting to roll left hard. The portside weapons bay doors are jammed open, acting like a damn air brake. Hydraulics are in the red and falling fast. There was a pause, filled only by the sound of the pilot's ragged breathing and the terrifying groan of stressed metal. I've got maybe a minute before I lose her completely. The Major's jaw tightened, a muscle twitching in his cheek. Understood, 2-1. Hold your current heading if you can. We're working on a solution from down here. He turned sharply, his eyes sweeping the hangar with a desperate urgency. Most of the base's flight crews, the ones capable of scrambling for an emergency launch, were either out on sorties or off duty. The precious minutes it would take to recall them and prep another aircraft were minutes that the pilot of Gunship 2-1 simply didn't have. His gaze fell on the only other operational Apache in the hangar, the one sitting directly under the lights, its M230 chain gun freshly serviced, its systems rechecked, its fuel tanks topped off. And then his eyes landed on Amy. She hadn't moved since the first mayday call came in. She stood beside the aircraft, her gloved hands resting lightly on its nose, her head tilted slightly as if she were listening to the distressed pilot's voice with more than just her ears. It was as if she could feel the wounded machine's pulse through the cold armor plating, as if she understood its pain. Captain Davis stepped forward, his voice cutting through the tension. "Major, we can take this one. She's hot and ready to go." The Major hesitated, his mind racing through a dozen impossible calculations. "You're suggesting?" "I'm suggesting we've got maybe 90 seconds before that bird either falls out of the sky or goes into an unrecoverable spin," Davis cut in, his voice sharp and insistent. "You've got no other airframes prepped, no other gunners on deck. Unless you want to stand here and watch gunship 2-1 hit the dirt, we move. Now." Major Jenkins's gaze flicked back to Amy, his eyes weighing the unknown risk of her mysterious past against the certain disaster that was unfolding in the skies above them. It wasn't a choice. It was a necessity. "You up for this, Carter?" he asked, his voice rough. Amy met his stare without blinking, her gray eyes clear and steady. "Tell me where you want me," she said. It was all the confirmation he needed. "Get her in the front seat, Captain. You fly." Major Jenkins's words were the spark that ignited the hangar into a frenzy of controlled chaos. The order acted like a switch had been thrown, transforming the stunned onlookers into a highly efficient team. Ground crew members who had been frozen in place moments before now swarmed the Apache. They moved with a practiced, almost balletic grace, pulling the heavy wheel chocks away, disconnecting the thick shore power cables, and rolling the auxiliary power unit clear of the aircraft's path. The tense silence was shattered by the high-pitched whine of the Apache's auxiliary power unit, APU, kicking over, the first breath of the powerful machine awakening from its slumber. Amy moved toward the gunner station ladder without a moment's hesitation. She climbed into the front cockpit with a smooth, practiced ease that was startling to watch. There was no fumbling with unfamiliar straps, no awkward shuffling to get into position. She slid into the seat as if it were a second skin, her movements fluid and economical. She adjusted the 5-point harness with 2 sharp pulls, the buckles clicking into place with a satisfying finality that resonated through the cockpit. Behind her, Captain Davis swung into the rear pilot's seat, his hands immediately flying across the control panel. He ran through the pre-flight startup checklist so quickly that his voice was almost a blur over the internal intercom system. Power up, rotors engaged, fuel feed green, all systems nominal. Above them, the 4 massive blades of the main rotor began their slow, heavy churn, each rotation gathering momentum, pulling more and more air into a growing, invisible storm. The powerful downdraft kicked up dust and loose debris from the hangar floor, creating a swirling vortex around the helicopter. The sharp, pungent smell of kerosene exhaust curled through the air, mixing with the familiar tang of metal and grease. "Clear left, clear right," Davis called out, his voice tight with focus, the adrenaline of the moment sharpening his senses. The crew chief on the ground gave a sharp, decisive hand signal and then sprinted back to a safe distance. With a gentle touch on the controls, Davis eased the Apache forward. The wheels rolled smoothly over the painted yellow lines on the hangar floor, the massive machine moving with a surprising grace. He turned the helicopter toward the yawning mouth of the hangar, the bright daylight outside a stark contrast to the dim, artificially lit interior. The moment they crossed the threshold, the full force of the afternoon sun hit Amy's face, bright and sharp, reflecting off her visor. The rush of open air slammed into the cockpit, carrying with it the scent of dust and sun-baked concrete. "Tower, this is gunship 1-3, lifting to intercept gunship 2-1, Davis reported into his helmet mic as he gently eased up on the collective. The helicopter rose into the air, its skids leaving the ground with the smooth, unwavering steadiness of a perfectly balanced machine under the control of a master pilot. Amy's head was on a swivel, her eyes scanning the horizon, flicking over the terrain below and searching for the distant, metallic glint of the crippled Apache. Over the intercom, the stricken pilot's voice came through again, tighter now, the strain of his ordeal evident in every word. 1-3, I've got no joy on stabilizing the bay doors. It feels like I'm dragging an anchor on the left side. Hydraulics are dropping fast. Amy's hands moved over the weapon control panel in front of her. She wasn't preparing to fire. She was powering up the targeting systems, accessing the diagnostic subroutines. She could hear the quiet whine and click of the servos in her own aircraft responding to her commands, feel the faint vibration through the frame as the gun mount shifted. She was trying to establish a data link to see if she could bypass the damaged systems on the other helicopter and force the jammed mechanisms to respond. The Apache, now designated gunship 1-3, climbed rapidly, the powerful turbine engines roaring as Captain Davis pushed the aircraft to its limits. The ground fell away below them, the sprawling airbase shrinking to a neat grid of runways and buildings. The air grew thinner, cooler, and the sky above deepened to a brilliant, cloudless blue. Amy's focus was absolute, her attention divided between the sprawling landscape rushing past below and the complex array of data scrolling across her multifunction display. She was no longer just a mechanic. She had become an extension of the machine, her mind processing information at a speed that would have been overwhelming to an untrained observer. She was monitoring engine temperatures, rotor RPM, and hydraulic pressures, while simultaneously trying to establish a secure data link with the floundering gunship 2-1. "I'm pitching left because your drag is uneven," she said into the comms, her voice a beacon of calm in the storm of the crisis. Her tone was level and instructional, as if she were explaining a simple training drill rather than talking a fellow aviator through a life-or-death situation. "I'm going to try to cycle your weapons bay from here. Stand by." In the rear cockpit, Captain Davis glanced forward, his brow furrowed in a mixture of confusion and awe. "Can you even do that remotely?" he asked, his voice tight with disbelief. The systems weren't designed for that kind of cross-platform interface. It was a theoretical capability, something buried deep in the technical manuals, but not a procedure that was ever practiced. Amy didn't answer him with words. Her fingers danced across the control panel, a blur of motion as she initiated a complex maintenance override sequence. It was a digital skeleton key, a back door into the aircraft's central nervous system that was known only to a handful of specialist technicians and, apparently, to her. She was bypassing the damaged actuator on the other aircraft, sending a direct command to the bay door mechanism. The system groaned in protest, the feedback on her screen showing a massive power surge as the motor strained against the damaged, twisted metal of the door frame. On the horizon, they could now see Gunship 2-1, a dark shape wobbling precariously against the bright sky. As they watched, the port side bay door twitched, then shuddered violently. For a moment, it seemed as if the entire wing assembly would be torn from the fuselage. Then, with a final, jarring lurch, the door slammed shut. A moment later, the starboard door followed suit. Doors sealed. The pilot of the stricken bird let out a choked cry of disbelief over the radio. "Roll is stabilizing. I have control. You're still heavy on the port side from the hydraulic leak." Amy cut in, her voice still calm and measured. "But you can make the runway. Keep your nose 5 degrees to the right and let the trim do the rest. Don't fight it." Major Jenkins's voice came over the open channel from the tower, the relief in his tone palpable. 1-3, good work. Escort her home. Keep her in your sight the whole way." "Copy that, tower," Davis replied, his own voice filled with a newfound respect. He banked the Apache gently, positioning them just off the wing of the damaged helicopter. The two powerful machines angled back toward the airfield, their rotors flashing like silver arcs against the deep blue sky. From her vantage point in the front seat, Amy could see the emergency crews already racing to the far end of the tarmac, fire trucks and ambulances in tow, their lights flashing in the bright afternoon sun. As they descended, Gunship 2-1 wobbled, but held its line. The pilot, guided by Amy's calm instructions, brought the aircraft in for a gentle landing. The skids kissed the runway in a puff of dust and smoke. It rolled to a stop, its rotors still chopping the air, but it was safe. It was on the ground. Davis landed their Apache alongside it, the skids clanging softly onto the concrete. Amy powered down the systems, her fingers moving with the same deliberate, methodical care she had shown on the hangar floor just a short time ago. When the canopy opened, the roar of the rotors once again became a deafening hurricane of sound. She climbed down from the cockpit first, her boots hitting the ground with the solid, reassuring weight of someone who had been here before, who knew the feel of solid earth after a dance with disaster in the sky. The airfield crew stared, their faces a mixture of profound relief and a kind of bewildered awe. They had just witnessed something that defied easy explanation, a near-certain catastrophe averted by a sequence of events that seemed almost impossible. Their gazes shifted from the damaged but intact gunship 2-1 to the quiet, unassuming woman who now stood on the tarmac, her gray jumpsuit ruffled by the rotor wash. The rescued pilot, a young lieutenant whose face was pale under his visor, stumbled out of his cockpit, his helmet tucked under one arm. His expression was a chaotic blend of gratitude, shock, and utter confusion. He looked at Amy, his eyes wide. "Who the hell are you?" he asked, his voice loud enough to be heard over the winding down turbines. Amy didn't answer him. She didn't even seem to register his question. She just turned and began walking back toward the hangar, her gloves still on, her visor down against the glare of the afternoon sun. The crowd of ground crew and emergency personnel parted for her instinctively, a silent, respectful corridor opening up in her path. Inside the hangar, Major Jenkins and Captain Davis were waiting. Neither man spoke as she approached. The only sound was the fading thump-thump-thump of the rotors outside as the pilots completed their shutdown procedures. She stopped a few feet away from them, her shadow falling long across the concrete floor. The Major's eyes held the weight of 1,000 questions, but he seemed to know that he wouldn't get the answers he was looking for. "Not here, not now." "Good work, Carter," he said finally, his voice rough with emotion. Amy stripped off her gloves and placed them neatly on the workbench. "The gun's ready for the next op," she replied, her voice as calm and steady as ever, as if nothing out of the ordinary had happened. But in the charged electric silence that followed, every single person in that hangar knew that something had shifted. A line had been crossed. The quiet mechanic they had all underestimated, the woman they had joked about just an hour before, was something else entirely. And the mystery of who she was had just deepened into an enigma that no one knew how to solve. The murmur began as soon as she stepped past the threshold of the hangar. It was low at first, a ripple in the background noise, but it traveled quickly through the assembled crew, one voice leaning into another, half-formed sentences spilling into wild speculation. "She just closed it? From here? No way. She had to have known that override code. You don't find that in a manual. Did you see how she strapped in? Like it wasn't her first time. Not by a long shot." Amy moved through the rising tide of whispers as if they were nothing more than a gentle breeze, her focus already back on the task at hand. She headed for the workbench where her tools still lay in their neat, perfect alignment. The dull thud of her boots on the concrete was a steady, measured rhythm, a counterpoint to the restless, excited shifting of the others. Major Jenkins remained by the far wall, one shoulder leaning against a steel support beam, his gaze tracking her every move, his face an unreadable mask. He was a man who prided himself on knowing everything that happened on his base, but the scene he had just witnessed didn't fit into any of the neat, orderly boxes his decades of training had prepared for him. Beside him, Captain Davis stood with his arms crossed, his helmet still tucked under one arm. His jaw worked silently, as if he were chewing over a dozen different questions, each one more impossible than the last. The hangar crew, while still talking amongst themselves, avoided looking directly at her for too long. But their eyes kept drifting back, pulled by the same magnetic, unanswered question. Who was she, really? She peeled off her flight harness, setting it on the bench with quiet precision, then picked up a clean rag and began the routine process of wiping down the cannon's housing. It was as if the last 30 minutes, the frantic mayday call, the desperate race against time, the shadow of a falling gunship, had never happened. Major Jenkins pushed himself off the support beam and crossed to the corner where the communication station sat. He leaned toward the young crew chief who had tried to run Amy's records earlier. "Try it again," he said, his voice pitched low enough not to carry across the hangar. "Use my authorization. Level 5 clearance. Search every database we have access to, active and archived." The young specialist hesitated for a fraction of a second, then nodded, his fingers flying across the keyboard. He brought the personnel interface back online, typing in the Major's high-level access codes. Name, assignment history, qualifications, the same search parameters as before, and the same result. Her service record prior to her arrival at this base 2 years ago was a complete blank, a digital void where career should have been. It was as if someone with extraordinary authority had taken a surgical blade to the archives and excised her past. Jenkins's brow furrowed. "Check the off-net archives," he instructed, referring to the deep, classified servers that weren't connected to the main military network. Cross-reference with Joint Service Special Operations databases. A few more keystrokes, a few more tense moments of waiting, and the result was the same. No enlistment entry, no training cycle, no listed deployments. Only the tail end of a career that had seemingly begun in mystery. Captain Davis had noticed the exchange. He stepped closer, his boots striking the floor with enough weight to draw a few curious glances. "You won't find anything, sir," he said quietly. Jenkins glanced up, his eyes sharp. "You sound sure of that, Captain." Davis's expression was unreadable, but there was a hint of grim certainty in his voice. Because records like that don't just disappear by accident. They're erased, purged, and there are only a handful of units with the authority to do that. Across the hangar, Amy continued her work, the steady, rhythmic motion of her hands giving no indication that she was aware of the intense scrutiny she was under. But Davis couldn't shake the memory of how her hands had moved over the cockpit controls, not like a mechanic, but like a seasoned operator. He remembered the calm, authoritative cadence of her voice as she had issued instructions to the stricken pilot, the voice of someone who had been under fire before and had come out the other side. The conversations around them grew bolder now, the volume rising in proportion to the distance from her. Could be she transferred from another branch. CIA maybe, or Black Ops, one of those units that doesn't officially exist. Maybe she just trained somewhere off the books, a private contractor or something. Davis let the voices run their course, a meaningless chorus of speculation. He knew what the others didn't. He knew that the insignia on her arm, the broken eagle with the shattered arrow, didn't belong to any conventional chain of command. It was tied, in whispers and rumors, to missions that never made it into the after-action reports, to operators who were ghosts. He finally stepped away from Jenkins and closed the distance to the workbench. Amy glanced up as his shadow fell across her tools. "Why didn't you say anything out there?" he asked, keeping his voice low enough that only she could hear. She set the cleaning cloth down, her movements unhurried. "Would it have made a difference?" "It might have made me understand what I was dealing with," he countered. Her gray eyes met his, and for a moment, the bustling hangar seemed to fade away around them. "You didn't need to understand," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "You just needed to fly." Before Davis could formulate a reply, Major Jenkins's voice cut in from behind them, sharp and authoritative. "Captain with me. Now." The Major's tone carried the weight of a man who was about to make a decision that could reshape not just the rest of the day, but potentially the rest of their careers. They stepped away, walking toward the administrative offices that overlooked the hangar floor, leaving Amy alone with her tools and the low, persistent thrum of conversation. From the glass-walled office above, Jenkins looked down at her solitary figure, a small island of calm in a sea of speculation. "You've been in this man's army longer than I have, Captain," Jenkins said, his voice a low rumble. "Ever seen someone pull a remote override like that?" Davis shook his head, his eyes still fixed on Amy. "Never. not without a gunner's qualification and extensive systems training. And even then, not with that kind of speed and precision. She didn't even hesitate. It was like muscle memory. Jenkins's gaze remained on her, his expression grim. If she is who I think she might be, then we're not supposed to have her here. Not on a regular army base. Not without clearance from a level of command far higher than mine. What do you plan to do, sir? Davis asked. The major didn't answer right away. His eyes narrowed, the lines on his face deepening as he weighed his options. First, he said finally, I want to see who else on this base noticed that patch. Below, Amy finished the last of her post-maintenance checks. She stripped off her gloves, setting them in their exact place on the bench. She didn't look up at the office windows, but if she had, she would have seen two senior officers watching her with the same intense, questioning gaze, though for very different reasons. By the time she left the hangar for the day, the speculation had mutated into something more potent and dangerous than simple curiosity. It was now tinged with a palpable sense of awe and a little bit of fear. People had stopped speaking in full sentences when she walked past. Instead, they fell silent, their conversations dying on their lips, the air thick with the weight of their unanswered questions. She crossed the tarmac toward the supply building, the wind tugging at the sleeves of her jumpsuit. The sun was dropping lower in the sky, casting long, distorted shadows that stretched like dark fingers across the pavement. Somewhere beyond the horizon, the faint roar of engines could be heard as other aircraft returned from their missions. Missions she wasn't briefed on and wouldn't be. Inside the supply building, the air was cooler, smelling faintly of canvas and oiled wood. She signed out a new set of calibration tools. The young clerk behind the counter glancing once at the patch on her arm before quickly looking away, his face flushing slightly. Word had traveled fast. When she returned to the hangar, Davis was waiting for her, leaning against the nose of the Apache she had just saved. He didn't bother with small talk. Major Jenkins is on a secure line with command, he said, his voice low. Your name is about to be in a lot more ears than you probably want. She set the heavy tool case down on the floor with a soft thud. Then maybe you should stop saying it. A corner of Davis's mouth curved up slightly, though it wasn't quite a smile. You're not making this easy, you know. I'm not here to make anything easy, she said, her voice flat and devoid of emotion. He studied her for a long moment, then shifted the topic. That override sequence, you improvised it. That's not a standard procedure. It worked. That's not the point. It's the only point, she replied, and turned back to the Apache, her body language making it clear that the conversation was over. Above them, in the glass-fronted office, Major Jenkins hung up the secure phone. His expression had shifted, hardening into something heavier, less like a man following orders and more like one standing at the edge of an approaching storm. They're sending someone, he told Davis when the captain stepped back inside the office. Who? Someone from a department that doesn't officially exist. Someone higher up the food chain than either of us. His eyes drifted down to the hangar floor. They want to assess the situation. Davis glanced down at her solitary figure. They're coming for her, then. Jenkins didn't confirm or deny it, but his silence said more than enough. The sound of rotors came first, a low, distant thrum that grew steadily in volume until the glass panes in the office window began to vibrate almost imperceptibly. Major Jenkins stepped to the window, his eyes narrowing against the glare of the late afternoon sun. A UH-60 Black Hawk slid into view, banking sharply as it approached the auxiliary landing pad adjacent to the main runway. Its matte black paint seemed to absorb the sunlight, and its markings were minimal, almost non-existent. There was no unit insignia, no tail art, just a small alphanumeric code stenciled in gray near the tail boom. This was not a standard transport helicopter. Davis joined him at the window. Not your standard transport for a goodwill visit, he observed dryly. Jenkins didn't respond. He was already moving toward the stairs, taking them two at a time. Davis followed close behind, neither man speaking as they descended to the hangar floor. Outside, the Black Hawk skids touched down with a soft puff of dust. The side door slid open before the rotors had even fully spun down, and a tall, imposing figure stepped out. The powerful downdraft from the blades snapped the edges of his dark field coat against his legs. He wasn't in a flight suit. He wore a simple, unadorned coat with no-name tape and no visible rank. A pair of mirrored sunglasses shielded his eyes, but they couldn't hide the weight of his attention as his gaze swept across the tarmac. Amy emerged from between the two Apaches just as the newcomer's boots hit the ground. The wind from the rotors caught her hair where a few strands had slipped from her bun, tugging them across her cheek. She didn't move to fix it. The man in the coat closed the distance between them quickly, his stride long and purposeful. Major Jenkins intercepted him halfway, offering a crisp, formal nod. "Sir." The man didn't return the courtesy. "Where is she?" he asked, his voice flat and cold. Jenkins stepped aside just enough for the man's line of sight to clear. "Over there, by the bird you just saw on your way in." The stranger's gaze fixed on Amy like a targeting reticle. He walked right up to her, stopping just a few feet away. "You're coming with me." Her expression didn't change. "On whose authority?" "On the authority of the people you used to work for." Davis moved in before she could answer, placing himself slightly between Amy and the stranger. "If you're here to pull her out, I'd like to know why." The man's head turned slightly, the mirrored lenses of his glasses reflecting the captain's face back at him. "That's on a need-to-know basis, Captain," he said flatly. "And you don't." The tense exchange drew the attention of everyone within earshot. Mechanics paused mid-task, their wrenches and rags hanging forgotten in their hands. Even the distant drone of the flight line seemed to fade beneath the weight of the standoff. Jenkins stepped forward, trying to de-escalate the situation. "If this is going to happen, let's take it somewhere private." But the man in the coat shook his head. "No point. Everyone here already saw too much today." Amy glanced around at the circle of curious, anxious eyes on them. The murmur from earlier had returned. Only now it carried a sharper edge of anticipation mixed with a palpable sense of unease. "What's this about?" she asked, her question directed not to the stranger, but to Jenkins. The major's answer was careful, his words chosen with precision. "They say they need you elsewhere. Somewhere that requires your particular background." And before you ask, the man in the coat added, "No, it's not optional." A heavy silence hung between them for a beat too long, the air thick with unspoken threats and unanswered questions. Then, in a slow, deliberate motion, Amy reached down, unfastened the cuff of her left sleeve, and rolled it up just high enough for the secret patch to be fully visible. The faded red and black threads of the broken eagle seemed to catch the dying light of the afternoon sun, flaring back to life like a banked ember. "If you want me to walk away from this hangar," she said, her voice quiet but carrying an unmistakable weight of authority, "you'd better be damn sure the people you work for are ready for what that means." The man in the coat's jaw flexed, a single, tight muscle twitching in his cheek, but he didn't answer. Instead, he simply gestured with his head toward the waiting Black Hawk. Amy took a step forward, then stopped beside Captain Davis. She looked up at him, her gray eyes meeting his for a long moment. "You fly like you mean it," she said quietly, her voice almost lost in the sound of the idling rotors. "Don't waste that." Before he could reply, she moved past him. The crowd of onlookers parted instinctively, creating a clear path for her as she headed toward the waiting helicopter. The sound of the rotors swelled again as the crew inside prepared for takeoff. Major Jenkins and Captain Davis stood side by side, two silent sentinels watching as she climbed aboard. The man in the coat followed her in, pulling the heavy door shut behind them. A moment later, the Black Hawk lifted off the ground, banking sharply away from the base until it was just a dark speck against the bright, indifferent horizon. The hangar felt emptier than it should have. The crew slowly drifted back to their work, but their focus was fractured, their movements listless. Tools clinked against metal without their usual rhythm. Conversation started and then died halfway through, the unspoken questions hanging in the air. Davis finally broke the quiet. "She's not coming back, is she, sir?" Jenkins didn't answer right away. He stared out at the empty sky where the helicopter had disappeared. "If she does, Captain," he said at last, his voice a low, weary rumble, it'll be because she decided to, not because anyone here went to get her. They both turned their gaze toward the Apache she had worked on, its nose pointed toward the open hangar doors. The machine sat silent and still, but something about it seemed to carry the residue of the day's extraordinary events, as if the very air around it remembered more than it should. Outside, the faint hum of the Black Hawk faded completely, leaving only the sound of the wind moving across the empty tarmac. The air was cooler now, but it carried with it the unsettling sense that the real storm was still on its way. Some battles are fought in the harsh light of day, for all the world to see. Others happen in shadows, where names are forgotten and victories have no witnesses. She had walked back into that hangar as a simple mechanic, and she had left it as a legend reborn, carrying the weight of a squadron the world believed was dead. Amy's story is a testament to the quiet heroes who live among us, their skills hidden, their sacrifices unseen. If her story moved you, share it with someone who needs to be reminded that heroes don't always wear capes. If you too have fought unseen wars, subscribe to Veteran Biker and become part of our next mission. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done in her place? Until next time, fly safe. And for all those who serve in silence, comment respect.